July 4th, 1456. The sky above Belgrade turned black, not from clouds, but from Ottoman arrows. 100,000 soldiers, the most powerful army on earth, surrounded a crumbling fortress defended by just 7,000 desperate men. The Ottoman Sultan had conquered Constantinople 3 years earlier. Now, he wanted all of Europe, and only one city stood in his way. What happened next would change the course of history forever. This is the story of the siege that saved Christian Europe. And you won't believe how it ended. Let me take you back to 1453, 3 years before our story begins. Because to understand why Belgrade mattered so much, you need to understand what the Ottomans had just accomplished. On May 29, 1453, Sultan Mehmed II did the impossible. He conquered Constantinople, the city that had stood for over 1,000 years. The impregnable walls that had repelled countless invasions, shattered by massive cannons. The Byzantine Empire, heir to ancient Rome, erased from existence in a single day. When news reached Europe, panic spread like wildfire. If Constantinople could fall, nowhere was safe. The Ottomans weren't just another empire. They were a military machine that seemed unstoppable. Their janissaries, elite soldiers taken as children and trained for war, were the most feared warriors in the world. Their artillery could demolish any wall. Their cavalry could outmaneuver any European army. And now, Sultan Mehmed II had a new title, Mehmed the Conqueror. But he wasn't satisfied. He wanted more. He wanted all of Europe. And his next target was clear, Hungary, the gateway to the heart of Christian Europe. But there was one problem. One fortress stood between the Ottoman Empire and their conquest of Hungary. One city that controlled the vital routes into Central Europe, Belgrade, and Mehmed knew that if he could take Belgrade, nothing could stop him from marching straight to Vienna, then Rome, then the rest of Europe. So in the spring of 1456, Mehmed began assembling the largest invasion force Europe had ever seen. Shu-1 soldiers, 300 cannons, including massive siege guns that had demolished Constantinople's legendary walls, 200 ships to control the Danube River. This wasn't just an army. This was an overwhelming tide of destruction that was about to crash against Belgrade's walls. Now let's talk about what Belgrade had to defend itself with. And trust me, the numbers will shock you. The fortress of Belgrade sat at the confluence of the Sava and Danube rivers. Strategically, it was perfect, but structurally, it was falling apart. The walls were old, crumbling in places. The garrison? Barely 5,000 soldiers, and most of them weren't even professional warriors. They were Hungarian peasants, militia, and volunteers who'd never faced an army like this. The military commander was a 70-year-old man named John Hunyadi. Yes, 70 years old. Most men his age were retired, sitting by fires telling stories of their youth. But Hunyadi, he was Hungary's greatest general, a legendary warrior who'd spent his entire life fighting the Ottomans. And he knew this might be his final battle, but here's where it gets interesting. Hunyadi wasn't alone. Fighting alongside him was a man who would become the real hero of this story, a Franciscan friar named John of Capistrano. Now, you might be thinking, a friar? A monk? What's he doing in a battle? Well, let me tell you about this absolutely fearless 70-year-old priest. John of Capistrano wasn't your typical religious figure. This man was a firebrand preacher who'd spent months traveling across Hungary. Delivering passionate sermons about defending Christianity, he told peasants that God wanted them to fight. He promised them that faith would protect them against Ottoman steel. And somehow, incredibly, thousands believed him. He arrived at Belgrade with an army of crusaders. But these weren't knights in shining armor. These were farmers carrying scythes, blacksmiths with hammers, old men with hunting bows. They had almost no military training, barely any armor, and were facing the most professional army in the world. By every logical measure, they were marching to their deaths. So now you have this setup: 100,000 elite Ottoman warriors with massive cannons versus 7,000 Hungarians. half of whom were elderly or untrained peasants led by two 70-year-old men. One a general, one a monk. This should have been a massacre. And for the first few weeks, it looked like it would be. On July 4th, 1456, the Ottoman army arrived at Belgrade, and the bombardment began immediately. Imagine the sound, the earth-shaking roar of 300 cannons firing simultaneously, the screaming whistle of cannonballs the size of wagon wheels hurtling through the air, the deafening crash as they slammed into stone walls, sending chunks of masonry exploding in all directions. The defenders had never experienced anything like this. Constantinople's walls, far stronger than Belgrade's, had crumbled under this bombardment. How long could Belgrade's old, worn fortifications last? Mehmed had brought his largest cannon, a monster called the Great Turkish Bombard. This weapon could fire a 600-pound stone ball over a mile. When it fired, the ground shook. Buildings trembled. And whatever it hit ceased to exist. Day after day, the bombardment continued. The walls developed cracks, then gaps, then gaping holes. Ottoman engineers calculated that within 2 weeks, the walls would be breached enough for a full assault. Everything was going according to plan. But inside the fortress, something unexpected was happening. Instead of panicking, the defenders were getting angry. John of Capistrano would walk along the walls during the bombardment, completely exposed to enemy fire, holding up a crucifix and shouting prayers. Cannonballs would miss him by inches. Stone fragments would fly past his head, and he wouldn't even flinch. The soldiers saw this and thought, if a 70-year-old monk isn't afraid, why should we be? Morale, which should have collapsed, somehow held firm. But morale doesn't stop cannonballs, and the walls were failing. On July 21st, after 17 days of constant bombardment, the Ottomans achieved their breakthrough. A large section of the southern wall collapsed completely. Mehmed's engineers reported that the breach was wide enough for a full-scale assault. The Sultan gave the order. At dawn, the Janissaries would storm the fortress. And everyone knew. When the Janissaries attacked, cities fell, always. That night, the defenders prepared for what they thought would be their last stand. Hunyadi gathered his commanders. They had a choice: surrender and live as slaves, or fight and die with honor. They chose death. But they were determined to take as many Ottomans with them as possible. July 22nd dawn, the attack began. 10,000 Janissaries charged toward the breach. These weren't ordinary soldiers. Janissaries were taken as children from Christian families, converted to Islam and trained from childhood to be warriors. They felt no fear. They showed no mercy. They were the most elite fighting force in the world, and they were about to pour through Belgrade's broken walls. The defenders positioned themselves at the breach, shoulder to shoulder, weapons ready. This was it, the moment that would decide everything. The Janissaries hit the breach like a battering ram. Steel clashed against steel, men screamed, blood flowed. The fighting was so intense, so brutal, that soldiers were literally climbing over piles of dead bodies to keep fighting. Hunyadi himself fought at the breach, swinging his sword despite his age. His personal guards begged him to pull back, but he refused. If his men were dying here, he'd die with them. For 6 hours, the battle raged at the breach. 6 hours of non-stop hand-to-hand combat. The Ottomans would push forward, the Hungarians would push back. Bodies piled higher and higher. The ground became so slick with blood that soldiers were slipping and falling. But here's what's incredible. The breach held. Somehow, impossibly, 7,000 defenders were holding back 10,000 Janissaries. The Ottomans, who had never failed to take a breach before, couldn't break through. Mehmed watched from his command post in disbelief. This wasn't supposed to happen. This couldn't be happening. By noon, the Ottoman assault had stalled. The Janissaries, for the first time anyone could remember, retreated. They'd suffered massive casualties and had nothing to show for it. Mehmed was furious. He ordered a second assault that afternoon. Same result. The defenders held. That night, the defenders celebrated. They'd survived the impossible. But Hunyadi knew the truth. They'd held for one day, but they couldn't hold forever. The Ottomans would attack again tomorrow, and the next day, and the day after that. Eventually, through sheer numbers and attrition, Belgrade would fall, unless Hunyadi had a crazy idea. An idea so reckless that his commanders thought he'd lost his mind. Instead of just defending, what if they attacked? What if they took the fight to the Ottomans? Everyone told him it was suicide. They were outnumbered 14-1. An attack would be a massacre. But John of Capistrano supported the plan. In fact, he made it even more insane. He said God had spoken to him in a vision. God wanted them to attack the Ottoman camp directly. Not a small raid. A full assault. He, a 70-year-old monk, would lead it personally. The commanders thought both old men had gone crazy. But the soldiers believed. Because these two fearless 70-year-olds had led them this far. Why stop now? On July 23rd, something happened that no one expected. Not even Hunyadi or Capistrano. Some of the Crusader volunteers, inspired by Capistrano's preaching and pumped with adrenaline from surviving the previous day's assault, decided they couldn't wait for orders. They grabbed whatever weapons they had and charged out of the fortress toward the Ottoman positions along the Danube. This wasn't part of any plan. This was pure, spontaneous, reckless aggression. About 2,000 peasants and crusaders just ... attacked, screaming prayers and battle cries. They rushed the Ottoman river fortifications. The Ottomans were completely taken by surprise. They just spent days attacking the fortress. The last thing they expected was for the defenders to attack them. The river guards panicked and fell back. And suddenly, these crusaders had captured several Ottoman ships and river positions. Hunyadi saw what was happening and had a split-second decision to make. He could order his men to retreat back to the fortress, or he could commit everything to this spontaneous attack. He chose the latter. He ordered the gates opened and led his entire garrison out in a full-scale assault. Now we had 7,000 Hungarians charging 100,000 Ottomans. On paper, this was mass suicide. In reality, it became one of the most shocking military victories in history. The Ottoman camp descended into chaos. They'd been relaxed, confident that tomorrow they'd finally breach the fortress. Now suddenly the defenders were in their camp, killing guards, burning supplies, and creating absolute mayhem. Mehmed tried to organize a response, but the attack had come too quickly. By the time Ottoman units could form up and counterattack, Hungarians were already in the heart of their camp, targeting the artillery positions. And this is where everything changed. Because those massive cannons that had bombarded Belgrade for weeks, they were now vulnerable. Hunyadi's men reached the artillery positions and started spiking the guns, making them unusable. Other soldiers set fire to the ammunition stores. Explosions rocked the camp. The very weapons Mehmed had used to destroy Belgrade's walls were now being destroyed themselves. John of Capistrano, wielding a crucifix like a weapon, led his crusaders straight toward the Ottoman command area. These farmers and peasants, who should have been terrified, fought with the fury of men possessed. They genuinely believed God was protecting them. And whether or not that was true, their fearlessness gave them an edge that professional soldiers couldn't match. The battle raged throughout the afternoon. The Ottomans, despite their overwhelming numbers, couldn't organize an effective response. Their camp was to spread out. The Hungarian attack had been too sudden, and the chaos made it impossible to use their numerical advantage. As evening approached, something unthinkable happened. Sultan Mehmed himself, the conqueror of Constantinople, was wounded. Some accounts say by an arrow, others by a sword. Either way, the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, who should have been safely behind his lines, had gotten too close to the fighting and paid the price. When word spread that the Sultan was wounded, Ottoman morale collapsed. Commanders started pulling their units back to protect Mehmed. The retreat began. Slowly at first, then faster. Then it became a full-scale rout. The Ottomans were running. 100,000 soldiers, the most powerful army in the world, were fleeing from 7,000 Hungarians. It was impossible. It was illogical. But it was happening. The Hungarians pursued them, capturing supplies, weapons, and even some of those massive siege cannons. The Ottoman army that had arrived 3 weeks earlier with such confidence was now scrambling to escape with whatever they could carry. By nightfall, the Siege of Belgrade was over. The Ottomans were in full retreat, and against every possible odd, the defenders had won. Not just survived, won. The aftermath of the battle was even more remarkable than the battle itself. Let me tell you what this victory actually meant for Europe. Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror who'd seemed unstoppable, was humiliated. He'd lost thousands of soldiers, hundreds of cannons, and most importantly, his aura of invincibility. The man who'd conquered Constantinople couldn't take a half-destroyed fortress defended by old men and peasants. He retreated back to Ottoman territory and wouldn't attempt another major invasion of Hungary for decades. The momentum that could have carried the Ottomans straight to Vienna was stopped cold at Belgrade. But the victory came at a terrible cost. John Hunyadi, the 70-year-old general who'd masterminded the defense, died just 3 weeks after the battle. Some say from wounds received in the fighting. Others say from disease that swept through the camp after the siege. Either way, Hungary lost its greatest military leader. John of Capistrano, the fearless monk who'd inspired thousands to fight, died just 3 months later, also from plague. He was later canonized as a saint, partly because of his role in saving Belgrade. To this day, church bells across Europe ring at noon to commemorate the victory, though most people don't even know why anymore. But here's what's truly important about this battle. It wasn't just about Belgrade. It was about what the victory represented. It proved that the Ottomans could be beaten, that their armies weren't invincible, that their cannons, their janissaries, their overwhelming numbers, all of it could be defeated by determination, courage, and brilliant leadership. Word of the victory spread across Europe like wildfire. Christian kingdoms that had been terrified of Ottoman invasion now had hope. The psychological impact was immeasurable. If 7,000 Hungarians could defeat 100,000 Ottomans, maybe Europe had a chance after all. Historians now agree that if Belgrade had fallen in 1456, the Ottoman conquest of Central Europe would have been almost inevitable. Vienna would have fallen. The German states would have been next. The entire trajectory of European history would have changed. Instead, Belgrade held, and Europe survived. Now, I know what you're thinking. How did this actually happen? How did such a small force defeat such a massive army? Let me break down the real reasons beyond the dramatic story. First, leadership. Hunyadi was arguably the best defensive general of his era. He understood that in siege warfare, morale matters more than numbers. He kept his troops fighting when they should have surrendered, and when he saw the opportunity for a counterattack, he had the courage to take it. Second, terrain and fortifications. Despite being damaged, Belgrade's position at the confluence of 2 rivers limited how many Ottomans could attack at once. The breach was only so wide. The Ottomans couldn't use their numerical advantage effectively. Third, the Ottomans made mistakes. Mehmed, overconfident from his Constantinople victory, underestimated his enemy. He didn't secure his camp properly. He positioned his artillery where it could be attacked, and he got personally involved in the fighting when he should have stayed back and commanded. Fourth, and this is controversial, the spontaneous attack by the Crusaders. That undisciplined charge that should have been a disaster, it worked because nobody expected it. Sometimes in war, chaos and unpredictability are more valuable than perfect planning. And finally, yes, there was likely an element of luck. Battles are chaotic. Small moments can have massive consequences. An arrow that hits or misses by inches can change everything. The Hungarians had fortune on their side that day. But don't let the analysis diminish what happened. This was still one of the most incredible military victories in history. 7,000 men held off and then defeated an army 14 times their size. That's not just luck. That's legendary. So what's the lesson here? What can we learn from the Siege of Belgrade? Maybe it's that numbers aren't everything. That determination and courage can overcome impossible odds. That great leadership matters more than resources. That sometimes the underdog really does win. Or maybe the lesson is simpler. Maybe it's just that as long as people are willing to stand up and fight for what they believe in, nothing is truly impossible. The Ottoman Empire would eventually recover and remain a major power for centuries. But they never forgot Belgrade. They never forgot that a ragtag group of defenders led by two 70-year-old men had humiliated the greatest army in the world. And Europe never forgot either. The victory became legend. It inspired countless stories, songs, and artworks. It gave hope to generations of Europeans who faced Ottoman invasions in the centuries that followed. Today, most people don't know about the Siege of Belgrade. It's not taught in schools. It's not made into Hollywood movies, but it should be, because this was the battle that saved Christian Europe. This was the moment when the unstoppable Ottoman advance was stopped by sheer human will. 7,000 against 100,000, and somehow, impossibly, miraculously, the 7,000 won. That's not just history. That's legend. And every word of it is true.